The Constitution is seen as the supreme law of the land. It is the very foundation that guides a country to its success or downfall. Thus, the Constitution must always be incorruptible to ensure the safety of the citizens of a country. Today, we are going to take a look back at how our Constitution evolved from 1898 to the present.
In 1899, the Malolos Constitution, the first Philippine Constitution and the first Republican Constitution in Asia, was drafted and adopted by the First Philippine Republic, which lasted from 1899 to 1901. In order for us to understand it, let's take a look on this. In Philippine history, it is common knowledge that the Spaniards colonized us for about 333 years. It was thought that it is a very dark moment for us Filipinos until the Spanish-Filipino Agreement came. It was called the Pact of Biak na Bato. The Spanish government agreed to grant self-rule to the Philippines in 3 years if Aguinaldo would go on exile and surrender all his arms. Aguinaldo agreed to this idea and went on exile in Hong Kong. However, there were trust issues between Spaniards and Filipinos. The Spaniards did not pay the agreed amount. As a consequence, the Filipinos did not surrender their arms, so the agreement became a failure. This forced Aguinaldo to go back to the Philippines and declare the country's independence from Spain in June 12, 1898 in Kawit, Cavite. But the U.S. made a secret agreement with Spain called the Treaty of Paris in 1899. The U.S. would seize the control over the Philippines from Spain. This forced Aguinaldo to issue a decree forming the Malolos Congress, which was a committee who was assigned to create the Constitution for the First Philippine Republic. 3 days after the First Philippine Republic was established, the Malolos Constitution, also called the 1899 Constitution, became the first constitution of the country and the first Republican Constitution in Asia. The Malolos Constitution had 3 following distinct features. First, a popular representative government. Second, a unicameral legislation. The assembly had full control over the executive power, which in turn, the president is elected by the assembly. Third, there is a separation of church and the state. Fourth, there was already the Bill of Rights. And lastly, it promulgated already the compulsory and free basic education. However, the Constitution was not fully implemented because of the eruption of the Filipino-American War.
The Philippine-American War lasted for 3 years. It began on November 1899 and lasted until the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901. Amidst all controversy, the Roosevelt administration declared victory in 1902.
On July 1, 1902, the U.S. Congress approved the Philippine Organic Act. It is also known as the Philippine Bill of 1902 or the Cooper Act, named after its author, Henry Allen Cooper. The Philippine Organic Act provided for the creation of an elected Philippine Assembly only if the 3 provisions set are fulfilled. These were the complete restoration of peace and order in the Philippines, accomplishment of a nationwide census, and 2 years of continued peace after the publication of the census. The convening of the Assembly is followed by the creation of a bicameral legislative body with the Philippine Commission as the upper house and the Philippine Assembly as the lower house. The supervision of the islands was assigned to the War Department's Bureau of Insular Affairs. Other key provisions of the Cooper Act include a Bill of Rights for the Filipinos, conservation of the Philippine natural resources, the disestablishment of the Roman Catholic Church, exercise of executive power by the civil governor who would have several executive departments, ratification of all changes introduced in the Philippine government by the President of the United States, and appointment of 2 Filipino non-voting resident commissioners to represent the Philippines in the United States Congress. This act was superseded by the Philippine Autonomy Act, or the Jones Law, enacted on August 29, 1916.
On August 29, 1916, the Jones Law, or the Act of Congress known as the Philippine Autonomy Act of 1916, was approved. It was the first formal and official declaration of the United States' commitment to grant independence to the Philippines.
Jones Act, formerly Philippine Autonomy Act of 1916, statute announcing the intention of the United States government to withdraw their sovereignty over the Philippine Islands as soon as a stable government can be established therein. The U.S. had acquired the Philippines in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War, and from 1901, legislative power in the islands had been exercised through a Philippine Commission effectively dominated by Americans. The law aimed at providing the Filipino people broader domestic autonomy, though it reserved certain privileges to the United States to protect their sovereign rights and interests. Jones Law replaced the Philippine Organic Act of 1902, or the Philippine Bill of July 1, 1902, that served as the de facto initial constitution of the Philippine Islands after it was ceded by Spain to the United States by virtue of the Treaty of Paris. Among the salient provisions of the Autonomy Act of 1916 was the creation of an all-Filipino legislature, which created the Philippine Senate to replace the Philippine Commission, which had served as the upper chamber of the legislature. The Jones Act remained in force as a de facto constitution for the Philippines until it was superseded by the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. Its promise of eventual absolute independence set the course for future American policy in the islands.
But before that, the Hire-Hire-Cutting Act was the first U.S. law passed, setting a process and date for Philippine independence. It was the result of the Osrox Mission, which campaigned for self-governance and Philippine independence. It was led by the former Senate President Sergio Osmeña and House Speaker Manuel Rojas. The Hire-Hire-Cutting Act was passed by the U.S. Congress, but it was vetoed by the U.S. President. However, the U.S. Congress overrode the veto. Then the Philippine Senate was required to ratify the law. However, with the leaders such as Manuel A. Quezon, who opposes it for such reasons, the law was rejected. This resulted to another bill which was recently stated, the Tidings-McDuffie.
The Tidings-McDuffie Act was passed by the Congress of the USA, granting administrative autonomy to the Philippines for a 10-year transitional period prior to independence. The law was named after its sponsors, Senator M. Tidings and J. McDuffie.
In 1934, the United States Congress passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, officially the Philippine Independence Act, a United States federal law that established the process for the Philippines, an American colony, to become an independent country after a 10-year transition period. The act mandated the Philippine legislature to call for an election of delegates to a constitutional convention to draft a constitution for the Philippines. The 1934 Constitutional Convention finished its work on February 8, 1935. The Constitution was submitted to the President of the United States for certification on March 25, 1935. It was in accordance with the Philippine Independence Act of 1934. The 1935 Constitution was ratified by the Filipino people through a national plebiscite on May 14, 1935. It came into full force and effect on November 15, 1935, with the inauguration of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. The 1935 Constitution provided the legal basis of the Commonwealth government, which was considered a transition government before the granting of the Philippine independence with American-inspired constitution. This means that the Philippine government would eventually pattern its government system after American government.
The 1935 Constitution also served as a basis for an independent Philippine government from 1946 until 1973. The framers of the Commonwealth Constitution were not completely free to choose any type of government they wanted, since their work had to be approved by United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But as many were legal scholars familiar with American constitutional law, they produced a document strongly modeled on the United States Constitution. In fact, the 1935 Constitution differed from the United States document in only two important respects. Government was unitary rather than federal governments being subject to general supervision by the President. And the President could declare an emergency and temporarily exercise near dictatorial power. The 1935 Constitution seemed to serve the nation well. It gave the Philippines 26 years of stable, constitutional government during a period when a number of other Asian states were succumbing to military dictatorship or communist revolution.
After the Americans surrendered, a new constitution was ratified by the Filipino collaborators who were called Kapisanan ng Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas, or popularly known as Kalibapi. This was now the 1943 Constitution, or the Constitution of the Japanese-sponsored Second Republic of the Philippines.
It created a powerful executive branch, subordinate legislative and judicial branches. The executive power is vested in President. The limited legislative power is exercised by the unicameral National Assembly and only anti-US can run. The judicial power is exercised by the Supreme Court, whose justices, together with judges of lower courts, are to be appointed by the President. Now, there was a problem with this constitution. It was recognized as legitimate and binding only in Japanese-controlled areas of the Philippines, and was completely ignored by the United States government and the Philippine Commonwealth government in exile. This was just a short-lived constitution because the American came back and freed us from the Japanese.
After the Japanese occupation, the American came back and granted us our independence on July 4, 1946, and we're still using the 1935 Constitution. In 1965, Ferdinand E. Marcos was elected as president. In 1969, he was re-elected for the second term and becoming the first president to be re-elected because of his desire in remaining in power.
During his time, there have been plans to make a new constitution because President Marcos believed that we must have our own constitutions that's free from foreign interference and to meet the many challenges that was being experienced by the Philippines since its independence in 1946. So, in 1970, delegates were elected to a constitutional convention at Manita Hotel, which began to meet in 1971. However, in September 21, 1972, under the 1935 Constitution, he issued the Proclamation Number 1081, placing the entire Philippines under martial law just before his last term ends. According to him, he declared martial law because of the growing communist threats in the country, but according to some, he declared martial law to influence the ongoing Constitutional Convention and to manipulate the drafting of new constitution on November 30, 1972. The draft of the 1973 Constitution was formally approved by the Constitutional Convention and was submitted to Citizen Assembly for ratification. On January 17, 1973, President Marcos issued Proclamation Number 1102 in which he announced that the 1973 Constitution had been ratified and which allowed him to rule until 1978, when the presidential system of the 1935 Constitution was replaced with a parliamentary government with a prime minister and the president.
Aside from enhancements done over the articles from the past constitutions, indeed, the 1973 Constitution has brought forth a very distinctive concept, as it was for the first time. The Philippines has established the very first parliamentary government with a prime minister and president. Another is that legislative powers was vested in a unicameral National Assembly elected by people. And the Constitution legalized the proclamation and the orders of the President. With this, the plebiscite has been changed, implementing the lower age requirement for voting, which also included the illiterate members of the society, giving Marcos a win-win standing on the re-elections that took place after the said implementation of the Constitution.
Since the ratification of the 1973 Constitution, several amendments were introduced. These were either initiated primarily to perpetuate Marcos's one-man rule or introduced to construct some semblance of democracy to his unpopular regime by experimenting with various political systems like the French semi-presidential system. The 1976 amendments were ratified in the referendum plebiscite held in October 1976 and were proclaimed in full force and effect in the same month. The most controversial among the 1976 amendments was Amendment Number 6. While 1973 Constitution vested legislative power in the National Assembly or the Batasang Pambansa, this amendment granted the concurrent legislative authority with the Parliament. By virtue of Amendment Number 6, Marcos virtually became a one-man ruler. It granted him legislative powers, even after the formal lifting of martial law on January 17, 1981. It was further amended up until 1980, 1981, and 1984. Notably, in 1984, the position of vice presidency was restored.
With the events occurred in 1980s, the 1973 Constitution was about to be repealed. In February of 1986, the Filipino people staged a large peaceful protest in EDSA, which would be known as EDSA Revolution. After Marcos has left the office, Corazon Aquino stepped into office, becoming the 11th president of the country. Immediately after her inauguration, the 1986 Constitution or the Freedom Constitution was promulgated. This was called the Proclamation Number 3. It adopted certain provisions from the 1973 Constitution as amended, which include the national territory, Bill of Rights, suffrage, and etc. The 1986 Constitution was by far the shortest constitution with only 7 articles. It served as a provisional constitution before a new and permanent constitution would be ratified.
Now, let's dig into our present Constitution, the 1987 Constitution, also known as the Anti-Marcos Constitution. After that one-year transitional constitution, according to reports, during the drafting of the Constitution, the members of the Constitutional Commission engaged in heated debates during various sessions on many issues, including death penalty, economic policies, land reform, form of government, and even the retention of American military bases in Clark and Subic, among others. The Constitutional Commission was able to finish its work after 133 days. According to Cecilia Muñoz Palma, who was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court in 1973 and was elected President of Constitutional Commission. On October 12, 1986, the draft constitution was passed, with 44 delegates voting for it and 2 against, and was presented to Aquino 3 days after. On February 2, 1987, a national plebiscite was held after a nationwide information campaign on the draft constitution. The question voters had to answer was, do you vote for the ratification of the proposed Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines with the ordinance appended thereto? The results of the 1987 plebiscite canvassed by the Commission on Elections based on returns from 83,288 persons, or a total of 21,785,216 votes across the Philippines. On February 11, 1987, through Proclamation Number 58, Aquino announced the results of the plebiscite and proclaimed the 1987 Philippine Constitution ratified. It took effect the same day. The 1987 Constitution has 4 themes. First is upholding of national sovereignty. Second is democratic governance and the prevention of dictatorship. Third is respect for human rights and civil liberties. And lastly, promotion of social justice. The Constitution established a representative democracy with power divided among 3 separate and independent branches of government: the executive, a bicameral legislature, and the judiciary. There were 3 independent constitutional commissions as well: the Commission on Audit, the Civil Service Commission, and the Commission on Elections. Integrated into the Constitution was a full Bill of Rights, which guaranteed fundamental civil and political rights, and it provided for free, fair, and periodic elections.
That's it! That's the overall evolution of our Philippine Constitution. There were ups and downs. Lives were sacrificed. There were too much blood, sweat, and tears that were exerted. However, the most important thing here is that we eventually attained the freedom that we wanted before. And at this moment, we are now uniting in making these laws put into action, all for the betterment and welfare of the Filipino people. Thank you for watching. Until next time.